Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the State Department. Appreciate you coming today. Joining us today in the briefing room are Special Representative for Venezuela, Elliot Abrams, and the Chargé d'Affaires of our Venezuelan Affairs Unit, James Story. They'll be presenting the latest developments with regard to the situation on the ground in Venezuela. We'll begin with an opening statement from Special Representative Abrams, and then they will both take a few questions. All right.
Thank you. Morning. I want to begin with a word about the Americans in detention in Venezuela. The recent improvement in conditions for the Citgo 6 is progress, but it is not enough. The group has been waiting 2 years for trial in their case and has suffered continuous cancellations of hearings 18 times now. They should be fully released now to be reunited with their families for the holidays. On January 5th, the Venezuelan National Assembly will vote on who will be its president for 2020. The National Assembly is the last democratic institution in Venezuela, and throughout 2019, it has been the target of attacks by the Maduro regime designed to make its functioning impossible. We join UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, who said on Wednesday, quote, "I urge the authorities to unconditionally release all persons who are being detained for political reasons," close quote. And we join in her call for, quote, "the unconditional release of parliamentarian Juan Requesens," close quote, who's now been held for 500 days. To date, out of 167 deputies, 32 have been detained, forced into exile, or had their constitutional immunities from prosecution revoked. These attacks have actually increased in the last week. On December 15th, the regime's communications minister, Jorge Rodriguez, accused 2 parliamentarians of conspiring to seize military installations with the aim of, quote, "destabilizing Christmas," close quote. DGCIM military intelligence officers then raided the home of one of them, Fernando Orozco, and soldiers attempted to detain his son. DGCIM officers tried to seize the other deputy, Annette Fermin, and detain her, and they raided her home and seized her passport. The next day, December 16th, the regime's captive Supreme Court removed the immunity of 4 additional parliamentarians so they can be tried for alleged crimes against the state, including treason, after the regime's Attorney General, Tarek William Saab, accused them of being involved in an alleged terrorist plot. On December 17th, 2 of the 4 denounced Sabine intelligence agents for threatening their homes and their families. Why? The 2 deputies said the regime's motive was to stop the deputies from voting in favor of Juan Guaido on January 5th, in favor of his re-election as National Assembly president. So what's going on here is simple. The National Assembly will vote on January 5, and the regime is using a combination of threats, arrests, and bribes, up to $500,000 per vote, we have been told, to stop the re-election of Juan Guaido. Threaten, exile, detain, bribe. That is step 1. Step 2 will be to try to grab control of the National Assembly by preventing free elections in 2020. The Venezuelan Constitution calls for National Assembly elections next year, and opinion polls make it obvious the opposition will win them if they're free. In her latest report on Venezuela, a couple of days ago, High Commissioner Bachelet said this, quote, "2020 will be an election year. It is crucial to guarantee public freedoms, which are fundamental for creating the necessary conditions for free, impartial, credible, transparent, and peaceful elections. In this regard," she went on, "I am concerned about the lifting of parliamentary immunity of 5 opposition parliamentarians, bringing the total to 30 parliamentarians who've been stripped of their immunity. as well as harassment of opposition representatives, including the President of the National Assembly. Close quote from High Commissioner Bachelet. Free elections for the National Assembly and free presidential elections are the way for Venezuela to emerge from its deep crisis. The Maduro regime appears intent on stopping them and closing off that peaceful path back to democracy and prosperity. The United States, the other nearly 60 nations that have recognized Juan Guaido as interim president because the May 2018 elections were fraudulent, and every country that seeks a peaceful way out for Venezuela through free elections can see exactly what's going on in Caracas. That is why we will continue our sanctions and strengthen them. It's why we applaud the sanctions against regime officials adopted under the Rio Treaty. And that's why we hope the EU will follow with additional sanctions on the regime. The Maduro regime fears free elections, so pressure is needed to get the free elections that can bring Venezuela out of the repression and poverty that have been the hallmark of the Maduro years. Question?